Imagine a world where the maps look different, where the ships sailed the other way, where the explorers didn't come from Europe, they came from Africa. You've been taught one version of history your entire life, a version where Africa was discovered, a version where civilization flowed in one direction. But what if that story was always backwards? What if Africa had colonized Europe instead? This isn't fantasy. This isn't revenge fiction. This is a serious historical thought experiment. And the more you follow it, the more it breaks everything you assumed was fixed about the world you live in. Let's go back. Way back. Further than you think you need to go. Around 3000 BCE, while most of Europe was scattered farming villages with no writing, no centralized government, and no long-distance trade networks, the Nile Valley was already producing one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Egyptian state had a bureaucracy, a standing army, a system of taxation, and monumental architecture that still confuses engineers today. Historian John Romer, in his detailed study of ancient Egypt, described the administrative complexity of the Old Kingdom as rivaling anything Europe would produce for another 3,000 years. 3,000 years. That's not a small gap. That's the entire span between now and the Roman Empire. And Egypt wasn't alone. Nubia, directly to the south, was producing iron tools and urban settlements at a time when much of northern Europe was still working with bronze or stone. The Kingdom of Kush, at its height, controlled more territory than most European powers of its era. Sub-Saharan trade routes moved gold, salt, and copper across distances that would have seemed impossible to the people living north of the Mediterranean. So the question isn't whether Africa had the capacity. It clearly did. The question is, what specific conditions would have needed to flip for African civilizations to project that power outward, across the sea, and into Europe? Here's where it gets interesting. The answer comes down to one thing almost nobody talks about in high school history class: ships. Not the technology of ships. Africa had boats. The Swahili Coast was already running sophisticated Indian Ocean trade routes by the first millennium CE, connecting East Africa to Arabia, India, and beyond. No, the question is about direction, about wind patterns, about the specific oceanic currents that made Atlantic exploration possible in one direction but brutally difficult in the other. When Portuguese sailors began pushing south along the African coast in the 1400s, they were terrified of a stretch of ocean they called the Sea of Darkness. And for good reason. The prevailing winds and currents along the West African coast pushed northward. Going south was relatively manageable. Coming back north was the hard part. Bartolomeo Diaz, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, spent months simply trying to figure out how to get home. Now flip it. Imagine a civilization on the West African coast, and the Malian Empire at its 14th century peak under Mansa Musa was one of the wealthiest states on earth. That develops deep water oceanic navigation, not southward, but northward and then westward. The currents running up from the Gulf of Guinea push naturally toward the Canary Islands, toward Morocco, toward the Iberian Peninsula. This isn't speculation about impossible physics. It's a question of historical timing, institutional investment, and incentive. And if that sounds far-fetched, consider this. Mansa Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr II, reportedly outfitted 2,000 ships in 1311 CE and sailed west into the Atlantic, never to return. His fate is unknown. His ambition was not. Now here's where we ask the real question. What if that ambition had turned north instead of west? What if the Mali Empire, or the Songhai, or the Kingdom of Benin, or the Swahili Coast trading networks had directed their organizational capacity toward naval expansion into a Europe that, in the 14th century, was devastated, fragmented, and deeply vulnerable? Think about the timing. The Black Death had just killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. The feudal system was cracking. The Catholic Church was in a legitimacy crisis. Entire regions of France, Spain, and England had labor shortages so severe that the social order was visibly collapsing. A well-organized external power arriving with trade goods, military discipline, and administrative systems would not have found a fortress. It would have found a continent on its knees. And if this is already reshaping the way you think about history, stick around. Hit like and subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that changes how you see the present, not just the past. What would African colonization of Europe have actually looked like? Probably not the way European colonization of Africa looked. Here's why. And this requires being honest about the specific brutality of what actually happened. European colonization was driven by a particular combination of factors: a gold and silver mercantile economy, a papal legal doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery that declared non-Christian lands legally available for seizure, and chattel slavery as an economic engine. These weren't universal human behaviors. They were specific historical products of a specific cultural and institutional moment. African empires of the same era operated differently. The Mali Empire's wealth came primarily from controlling trade routes, not from extracting forced labor at industrial scale. Taxation and tribute, yes. Enslavement as a marginal practice, yes. But not the transatlantic industrial system that would define European colonialism. Historian Nehemiah Leftion, in his foundational study of ancient Ghana and Mali, emphasized that West African imperial power was organized around commerce and conversion, not conquest and depopulation. So an African colonized Europe might have looked less like a resource extraction zone and more like a trading empire. A network of coastal ports, commercial agreements, and cultural influence radiating outward from African-controlled hubs in Lisbon, Seville, and Marseille. Which, frankly, is exactly the kind of nuanced power projection you'd expect from civilizations that had been running long-distance trade networks for centuries before Europeans figured out which direction was south. Not that anyone in 14th century Europe was in a position to argue about it. What does this alternate Europe look like by the 1700s? The Enlightenment might still happen, but it happens in a world where African philosophical traditions, Islamic scholarship from Timbuktu, and Nile Valley mathematics have been flowing into European intellectual life for 3 centuries. The scientific revolution occurs in a context where African astronomical knowledge and Arab algebra are not exotic imports but foundational givens. The very premises of what counts as civilization are different, because the power structure that defined those premises is different. And the slave trade almost certainly doesn't happen, or not in the form it took. The transatlantic slave trade was a specific product of European demand, African coastal state complicity, and American plantation economics. Remove European colonization of the Americas, which, in this timeline, either doesn't happen or happens much later and differently, and you remove the economic engine that made the trade viable. Historian Walter Rodney argued in his landmark work that the slave trade didn't just impoverish Africa, it structurally reshaped African societies to serve European extraction. In our alternate timeline, that engine never starts. What does this mean for you, living in 2026? It means the world you were born into, its racial hierarchies, its economic structures, its map of powerful and powerless nations, is not the inevitable result of some natural law. It is the result of specific choices, specific accidents, specific moments where history could have gone another way. The ships that sailed, the winds that pushed them, the diseases that killed, the manuscripts that burned. These were not destiny, they were events. And events are made by people, shaped by power, and understood differently depending on where you're standing when you look at them. You were taught that history flows in one direction, that progress moves from west to east, from north to south, from civilization outward into darkness. But the deeper you go, the more that story dissolves. What remains is messier, more complicated, and far more interesting. Imagine a world where the maps look different, where the ships sailed the other way. You've been living in one version of that story. Now you know there was always another.